Okay, good morning. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me and being very flexible around my own schedule. I managed to arrive yesterday afternoon, so I've got a bit of what you've been doing, but not everything yet. I have 25 minutes, so I just want to make a start because I have an ambitious plan for the 25 minutes. I want to share some ideas with you. Unfortunately, it would be much better to sit in a circle and talk about this, but time goes on. But I will stay here the whole day and hope to have further conversations if you want to start talking with me. So, the title of my talk is What is the Educational Question? And that's really what I would like to contribute to this much bigger conversation. The conference itself deals with important and urgent issues, and there was one line that really triggered me. We will explore how to turn conflict into an educational opportunity. But that then raises the question, what actually is an educational opportunity, or where do we locate the educational? And one point I'll try to make, it's somewhere in the background, is for me, we cannot simply solve that by saying that's about learning what we learn from each other, what we learned from these situations. So I want to propose a different way to pose the educational question. That's what I'll focus on. And then I also want to show how that, for me, is intrinsically related to the question of democracy. That's the plan of the talk, and I'll try to do that in 25 minutes. So I want to start with one of the really big questions. How do we understand the time we are living in? And of course, there are all kinds of hypotheses circling around. This is one that some academics get quite excited about. They say it's the time of the Anthropocene, but you can put all kinds of other notions there. The one I would like to explore as a way to characterize our time is to say we live in an age of shopping. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean shopping as what I call a paradigm. And what is the basic logic of shopping? The basic logic is that we have some desires, and what we look for is the quickest, easiest, cheapest, best value for money way to fulfill our desires. And I think that this has become a principle that is now permeating a lot of dimensions of contemporary life. One book I find tremendously helpful in getting deeper into that is a book by an American journalist, Paul Roberts, called The Impulse Society, where he makes the claim that many aspects of contemporary society are based on quick impulses and the quick satisfaction of those impulses. So the English subtitle of the book is What is Wrong with Getting What We Want? And Robert shows that there is actually a lot wrong when we begin to organize societies and our collective endeavors based on that principle. The American edition has a different subtitle, I found out. It's something like the United States, and something about, I forgot it, but it's about instant gratification. So he's saying we have societies that are based on a desire for instant gratification. And when you begin to look around, and this is partly what Roberts does, is that he shows how, for example, the economy is highly based on this principle of the instant gratification of desires. The claim you could make is that to a large extent, contemporary economies drive on the principle of desire. And if you want to get what's in that, I'm suggesting here, Apple doesn't sell mobile phones. What Apple sells, and that's a brilliant business model, is the desire for a new mobile phone. And they sell that for free, but once we have bought into that desire, then we're very happy to exchange cash for the thing. And you can see that happening in a lot of areas of the economy. But I also think that politics has fallen victim to this. where many contemporary politicians no longer say, if you vote for me, I will stand for a particular set of values that will become the organizing principle for doing our collective lives. A lot of politicians say, if you vote for me, I give you everything you desire. And that is how contemporary politicians often gain votes. And then once they are in office, they begin to realize that that is actually an impossible promise. I think you can see the principle also troubling democracy, particularly when democracy becomes expressed as a struggle for, you can say, the desire for pure identity. And many clashes around democracy has something to do with saying we want to have a place for our identity, but we want that identity to remain pure. And I think that, and I'll make that point a little later, is precisely what is not possible in a democratic society. The problem of the instant gratification of all our desires also creates environmental problems, where the planet is just seen as a resource for our desires, and where the whole question of should we limit our desires is constantly, in a sense, forgotten, although the planet has already been saying to us for decades, I cannot give you everything you want. My point is, and this is remarkably absent in Roberts' book, that education has also fallen victim to this impulse principle. And we see that particularly in the idea of the school or the college or the university as a kind of shop where the discourse goes around that you can learn what you want to learn, that the task of teachers is to facilitate the learning of students, and where the quality of education is measured in student satisfaction scores. And it was very telling that only yesterday afternoon, when I was walking to this conference, I got an email with an invitation to a conference in January with a 20% discount if I was quick, which was exactly about this point. It said something like how higher education should serve the customer. So this whole language is, I think, increasingly playing a big role in higher education. And the people speaking there are not educators, but they are people from the Office of State, Trade and Standards. So it's all about consumer protection. This is a form of student-centered education, and you can say what is really great about the progressive tradition in education is that it is student-centered, but the danger, to put it very quickly, is to put the student in the center is very different from saying we should treat students as consumers. Now, what is missing in this picture, to say it very quickly, what is missing is the encounter with what we could call the real. The encounter with other human beings, other students we encounter in schools who are not like us. The encounter with a planet that is precisely not an infinite resource, but also the encounter with the otherness of ourselves, including our bodies. So you could say, and again I'm doing this quickly to make some points, that student-centered education, and I would say both old and contemporary forms, run the risk of being what we could call ego-logical, that they function according to the logic of the ego and its desires. We also could call that an infantile way of existing, but I'll come back to the point. We should be very careful with that word because we shouldn't be giving infants or children a bad name. So when you begin to look at contemporary education from this angle and then ask what is actually the educational task, what is the central issue that's on our plate, I would say it is how we can help children, young people, but probably also ourselves, to put our desires in perspective, or even more precisely, to put the desires we have in dialogue with the world outside of us, the natural world, the social world. That this has something to do with education is something also found in the work of the French educational thinker Philippe Mérieux, who says very nicely that all the educational work is the difficult work, you can say, of disconnecting the child from the logic of desire. And the only thing I object to is the assumption that children have this problem and adults don't have this problem. I tend to think it may actually be the other way around. Now, one way to name this theme, and words are a bit difficult here, but I'm nonetheless going to suggest some words, is to say that the educational theme has to do with how we try and manage to exist in a grown-up way. And again, there is a nice phrase from Mérieux who says this is about being in the world without being in the center of the world. So you can say it's a decentered, or you can even play with it and say it's an eccentric existence that we should be after as educators. Now, this idea in itself is not new, but it has mainly figured in the educational tradition where adults claim that they know what the right desires are, and they think of education as the task of telling the next generation what they should be desiring. In some contexts, but I'm not sure about this context, I would say this is typical bad Catholic pedagogy where desire is sin, and if we get rid of our desires, then everything is fine. That no longer works. But that doesn't mean that the question has disappeared, and actually I'm thinking the question is a more urgent question in our time. So what I want to suggest is that for me the educational work, the educational task, is to make this question about the desirability of our desires into a living question, something we burden our students with in the hope that they will carry that question with them, not all the answers that are there. One way to formulate that, which I've done in my work, is to say education is about arousing the desire in another human being for wanting to exist in the world in this grown-up, decentered, eccentric way. Now that's a way to talk about education that's very different from learning, and that's partly the point I'm trying to make. Then the question is, what does that exactly mean, and how do we do that? So let me look quickly in a bit more detail at two aspects, this idea of being in the world and this idea of grown-upness. Being in the world has something to do with being, you can say, outside of ourselves, with others. And here I take inspiration from Hannah Arendt, who says what is really significant about the human condition is that we are beginners, that we are constantly taking initiatives. That's, you can say, how we begin to come into the world. But the key point is that when we take initiative, at some point we will meet the world, and that meeting is experienced as resistance. The physical resistance of materiality, the social resistance of other people who have other ideas about what should happen. That encounter with resistance, I think, is really important because it shows that the world is not a construction. If we had time, I would have a whole critique of constructivist thinking and education. So when we encounter resistance, we find out there is a world that exists independently from us and has its own integrity. And that you can say, some people say that's a wonderful experience. I tend to think it's also pretty frustrating because we want something and we meet a world that wants something else. Now, what can we do with that frustration? Very quickly, there are sort of three possible responses. One is that we say, I had a brilliant idea, I meet resistance, I don't like that, I'm going to push harder. And sometimes that's exactly what we need in order to make things happen. But the problem is that if we keep pushing and push too hard, we will ultimately destroy the very world that we want our initiatives to arrive in. So you can say at one extreme there is the danger of world destruction. But the other response to the frustration of meeting something that offers resistance is that we say, life is far too difficult, I can't cope with this, I begin to withdraw. So you can see that the other possible response ends up withdrawing yourself from the world, and ultimately we can call that self-destruction. And there you can begin to see something about what it means to really exist in the world. It means to try to stay away from these extremes of world destruction and self-destruction, and I call that a difficult middle ground. For me, this could be a definition of what the school is, but I haven't heard policymakers taking that up yet. Oh, that's a nice way to talk about the school. To be in that difficult middle ground, you can say, is about being in dialogue with what you are not. But here I don't mean dialogue as conversation. I tend to think that maybe there is a bit too much talk. Dialogue for me is precisely this existential form of trying to stay away from world destruction and self-destruction. And that is a lifelong challenge. That is not something we can resolve at some point in our lives. So if that says something about what it means to be in the world, then the question is, what is this quality of being there in a grown-up way? Now, the word grown-up is not a very helpful word, but I haven't yet found something that is better. What I do want to emphasize is to exist in a grown-up way is not the outcome of a developmental trajectory, where we say we've been here for 16 years or 18 years or 20 years and suddenly we are grown up, but it's a way of trying to exist in the world. That's where Mérieux's phrase, being in the world without putting yourself or thinking yourself to be in the center of the world, that tries to denote this quality. And it's important, and that's why on the one hand I like the word, but I want to disconnect it from developmental ideas. That we should see this, you can say, as an empirical question. So it doesn't mean that people who have been around in this world for a while know how to do it and always do it well. On the contrary, it also doesn't mean that the young people who are just arriving in this world have no clue how to do it. I tend to think the opposite is often the case. So it's about looking very carefully about what is happening. The educational question out of this question, is what I desire or what I meet in myself as a desire, because many of the desires we encounter are actually not our desires, but they come from somewhere else. Is that what I should be desiring? And that's a question for our own lives. Are these desires going to help me to live well? It's crucially a political question. Are the desires we have going to help us collectively to live well? But it's also the ecological question. So to try to exist in the world in a grown-up way is not about running behind your desires, but it's also, and that's important, it's not about suppressing your desires, because we need desires in order to be in the world and to exist there together. So it's an ongoing process of meeting our desires, questioning them, transforming them, selecting them. Here I still very much like the phrase from Spivak, who calls education the uncoercive rearrangement of desires. And I think that really addresses what I'm trying to say here well. So it's also not trying to get sort of your desires under the control of reason, because I tend to think that reason itself is a desire, or at least the desire for reason itself has no reason. So the work is located at a different level. And the ongoing question is which of our desires are going to help us to exist in the world in a grown-up way. Now, if that is an interesting, I was going to say reasonable way to think about education, then the question is, what kind of work do we need in education in order to engage with these dimensions? And I just want to highlight 3 qualities of education that become more visible, more into focus when you begin to think about education in these ways. I want to say something about interruption, about suspension, and sustenance. Although there is a lot of nice talk about saying education is about flourishing and development and letting all talents and everything grow, I don't think that that's an honest way to talk about the real challenge in education, because I think the work of education is interruptive work. It is about interrupting desires so that at least desires can become visible. You can say it's about interrupting ego-logical ways of being. It's also about interrupting identity. And I use the word interruption, not the word suppression, not the word destruction, but I'm saying the task of education is to make an entry into what is happening so that it becomes visible, you can say. For me, that means that education should not be curriculum-centered, just coming from all the good intentions we have, but also cannot be child-centered. I like to speak about the task of education as being world-centered, in the sense constantly turning students back to the world where they have to live their lives. So that means that resistance actually is an important active principle in education, which is the opposite of a lot of thinking about education that says everything should be smooth and pleasant and completely tailored on what students want. If this is part of the work to interrupt, that is not just to stop everything, but to create opportunities for paying attention to our desires. That means that education needs to work with the principle of suspension, of slowing things down, of making space, giving time, creating forms where we can meet, consider, and transform desires, and in a sense get the time to practice, to try out what it might mean to exist in a grown-up way. And here I've just put pictures of the 2 heroes of educational suspension, Janusz Korczak and A.S. Neal. They really understand what this idea is. So if education is about asking difficult questions and giving time to work through those questions, it's also important that we see that we have a job to do in supporting students to stay in that difficult middle ground, particularly because we are offering them things that in the short run don't look very attractive, always with the hope that in the longer term that may become the desirable alternative. This way of looking is not saying we no longer need curriculum, we just need to sit together and talk. I think it suggests a very different way to think about a curriculum, not as the stuff that needs to be acquired or learned, but curriculum, all the different subjects and areas, as specific ways of meeting the world and specific forms for practicing grown-upness. I started out as a physics teacher. I think physics offers a way of meeting the world and practicing grown-upness, just as mathematics, geography, art. So the real question is to look back at the curriculum as it exists and to ask, what do all these different areas have to offer in relation to this central educational question? For me, it also suggests a different way to talk about the school. There's an awful lot of talk that says the school is a place for learning, and I think if that's the justification for the school, we can better close the school, because Google can organize our learning much faster and much cheaper. So if there is still a reason to have schools, I would say it's precisely as a place where we meet the things we hadn't chosen, we hadn't expect to show up in our lives. A place for meeting the world, and we can call that meeting teaching, and a place for practicing what it means to exist in that world in a grown-up way. There's a nice analysis of the word school, which goes back to the Greek notion of school as free time. And there's something really significant there, because you can say that means the school is precisely the time we give to the next generation that is not yet captured by the logic of shopping. The school is the place where we try, we fail, we try again, and I really like this, and then we fail better. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and then you can say, so what about democracy? I'll do that very quickly, and I know there's much more discussion to be had here. I would say that the educational question, understood in this way, is also the democratic question. Because for me, democracy is precisely not about the will of the majority, but democracy itself is this process of the transformation of individual desires, the desires of individuals or groups, into, you can say, what collectively can be deemed desirable. So for me, the same dynamic that I've put at the heart of education is also, for me, the democratic question, not as free play, because I would say democracy is framed by a number of really important values. Sometimes I talk very theoretically with my students about this, but then I say, who needs political philosophy when we have the Rolling Stones? And if only technology would work. Because this is the point where you can say the whole message of democracy is not that you can have everything you desire. The whole point of a democracy is that you cannot get everything you want. So democracy, on the one hand, has a lot to do with the question of freedom, and you can say democracy offers freedom, but that's only half of the deal. Democracy, at the same time, asks grown-upness, and I think nowadays many people like democracy, but only for the first half of the deal, and they tend to forget the second half, and that's, I think, where education also comes back into the frame. So, to conclude, I've tried to make a suggestion about the educational question, and I've not spoken about learning or only saying that's not a question of learning. For me, it is a question of arousing a desire for existing in a particular way, which you can also call a democratic way of existing. That is a way to move education both beyond curriculum or program-centered approaches, but also, you can say, naive child or student-centered approaches, and to say education always has the job to turn students back towards the world, to be in the world but not in the center of the world. And I have suggested that that has an important message for our educational institutions as places that I think should not be understood in terms of the logic of shopping, but are these halfway houses that are outside of that. And for me, the big question is, as a society, do we still want schools? But I would say we need them now even more than ever. So thank you very much for your attention. This was fast, but if you want to read more, there's always more to read. Thank you.